Hello everyone, and welcome to episode number 23 of the Pregnant Hag Podcast. I have a very special guest today, and actually, I have looked forward to talking to her for a very long time. It's kind of been in the making and in the dreaming. So, my guest is Laura Perry, and I will just read out her bio to you. Laura Perry is a priestess and creator who works magic with words, paint, ink, music, textile, and herbs. She is the founder and temple mom of modern Minoan Paganism, as well as a third-degree Wiccan priestess, a Reiki master, and a longtime herbalist and naturopath. When she's not busy drawing, writing, or leading rituals and workshops, you can probably find her digging in the garden or giving a living history demonstration at a local historic site. So welcome, Laura. Thank you for finding the time to be here today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Yes, me too, because we're going to be speaking as practitioners and teachers working within two very different, like native, indigenous European traditions. So yours is the modern, Minoan paganism tradition, and mine is the Northern tradition. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But one of the things I want to do, I know that for most of my audience, people will be more familiar with my tradition. But I actually think it's very interesting to have a conversation where we compare things, like, what are the same things when we encounter and like what things might be different. So that's a thing I'm particularly interested in. Also a polite request, I try to make this podcast accessible to like anyone who listens. So it's not only for my advanced students of the Northern Tradition material. So when I ask you a question, would you please explain it on a level of a complete beginner, that like everyone who listens, will like understand what we're talking about. Otherwise, I fear things might get a little too esoteric, and I don't want to like lose people. But I hope that makes sense. So Laura, I would like you to tell us about a group you run. The title, at least on Facebook, is Ariadne's Tribe, Modern Minoan Paganism. And I know that the group has a website as well. And there's even a description I can read out. So Ariadne's Tribe is the home of modern Minoan paganism, a spiritual tradition that brings the gods and goddesses of the ancient Minoans alive in the modern world. We are a revivalist tradition, not a reconstructionist one. So we rely heavily on personal shared gnosis and the practical realities of paganism in the modern world. So that's a fantastic description, but would you please explain what is the difference between revivalist and reconstructionist?
Okay, so there's a fair amount of overlap, actually. And I've had people come up to me at conferences and say, technically you are a Reconstructionist tradition because you use Reconstructionist techniques, because we start with the archaeology, the artifacts. We don't have any written records from the Minoans because Linear A, which is the script that they wrote their language in, has not yet been deciphered.
Mm-hmm.
We have the archaeology, we have the artifacts, the art, we have comparative religion, because the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age was a place of very exciting cultural exchange, and so there are a lot of similarities around there. But because we have a lot of blanks to fill in, we can't know for certain how the Minoans practice their religion, either formally in the temples or casually in their homes. We can make educated guesses, but there are a lot of blanks to fill in. So there's that, and there's also the fact that we don't live in the Bronze Age, right? This is not, our world is not the same as the world was 3,500 or 4,000 years ago. And so our relationship with the gods is going to be different than it was for the people back then. So it might not be appropriate for us to do exactly the same things the ancient Minoans did in order to be in relationship with the gods. And so what we decided, and my title, my official title is Temple Mom. We are, we have people who are facilitators and who run the group, but we do our very best to do all of our work via consensus and discussion.
Yeah.
Both because that's the respectful thing to do now, but also because we think that that was the world view and mindset of the ancient Minoans. We think that they were not a dominator culture. They would have discussed and come to a consensus about things. And so we fill in the blanks mostly with shared gnosis. One of our board members is a professional dance ethnologist who specializes in the Mediterranean, and she has helped us fill in a lot of blanks with research, which is really fascinating. But so, yeah, that's why we're revivalist and not reconstructionist. We're not rebuilding exactly what the ancient Minoans did. We're taking the information we have about what they did and using that as the background for building something new in the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it means that you're true to the spirit of it. But as you say, we live in a very different time, and I run into that with my own students, where I sometimes have to remind them we cannot go and live in the Viking age again. We're not in the Viking era. So absolutely, as you say, there were some things that the Vikings did, or even not Old Norse peoples were Vikings. There were also farmers and people who stayed at home. But still, some of the things that they literally did just wouldn't be appropriate in today's society. So, we also have to make that distinction between what we can take and bring into sort of modern life and make it a very sort of, positive thing. And there are some things where we can say we maybe can arrive at our own version of that reflects the time.
Yeah.
So I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I have so many questions for you, where to start. I also wonder, I know how it works at my end, but at your end, what brings people to the Minoan tradition, and is everyone welcome, or do you operate as a group? Criteria for joining, how does that process work?
Okay, so the Facebook group is our official public discussion forum. And like you said, we have the website too. It's ariadnestribe.wordpress.com. Essentially, most people come to us because they're looking for something that that echoes the worldview and values of the culture of pre-modern cultures, especially egalitarian cultures or partnership cultures, as Rihanna Eisler calls them. We get people from a wide variety of backgrounds. There is no formula. We get a lot of people showing up saying, gosh, this particular deity has been appearing in my dreams, and when I went and looked online, I found you. So there's a lot of that. And we're not exclusive either. It's not like if you practice modern Minoan paganism, you can't practice anything else. And so we get people who started out in Hellenic paganism with deities, and then they feel like they are drawn toward what was before that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We get a lot of people who are looking for what was before classical era. What was there that wasn't that kind of mindset? What was before that? So
yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And we get that in the Nordic region as well. And sometimes my students are surprised when I tell them there was an era before the Norse gods as we know them. There was a whole sort of Bronze Age period before that, where things were going on that were quite different, which I'm personally quite interested in, but not all my students are interested in that. But yeah, I understand completely what you say there. And I also just wanted to clarify one thing for my own audience. You mentioned the word UPG, unique personal gnosis. I understand that to be very close to what in so-called shamanism we call shamanic journeys. Like, would you say that there is a difference, or is it very similar?
Okay, so gnosis in general means personal experience, literally means knowledge,
Yeah.
right? It is your personal knowledge of the divine. That can be achieved via shamanic journeys, via meditation, trance, even just by listening to the little voice in the back of your head. All those different methods for hearing. One of my friends calls it the God phone.
Yeah, that's
You know,
beautiful. Yeah.
So that's UPG is unverified or unique personal gnosis, and so each of us has our spiritual experiences filtered through our own psyche, right? So our biases and our life experience are going to color the way that we experience whatever the gods are sharing with us, and that may or may not match what anybody else is experiencing.
No,
so,
that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this thing called shared gnosis. And so if you have a bunch of people have the same experience without having talked with each other first, and they all show up explaining, describing the same thing, then you're on to something. And so that's how a lot of our fill in the blank work happens. Someone will ask a question, gee, who is this deity? We think we have this name from an ancient document, or we have this figure from folk dances in the area or something like that. Who is this? And we'll all go exploring, and we come and share, and the places where that overlaps, we figure we're probably on to something there.
Yeah. Yes. And that works the same way for many people in the Northern tradition. And then also you've not passed it on as that it is in the sagas or in the Poetic Edda. But like when teaching, you would say, well, like many people who work with Freya, have received the guidance that she likes this or that. And so yeah, we work in a similar way in our tradition. I'm just aware that the term shamanic journey, of course, comes from core shamanism, and it's not really a term that belongs in the Northern tradition. But like many people start, and people I work with, they do their basic training in core shamanism, and that's like how they develop their direct revelation experience, and then it will come into the Northern tradition. And many people I work with are not as familiar with the terms, unverified personal gnosis or shared gnosis. We know what it is, we use it, we just don't give it those names. So thank you for clarifying that, just so, the entire audience knows what we're talking about. That's really useful. I think my most exciting question for you, my burning question is, and I know you really know a lot about material, you've worked with it for years. Some people call you an expert, but I've seen you sort of sometimes say, oh, please don't. But I would call you an expert, if I may. So I'm wondering, did the ancient Minoans have trade routes to Scandinavia and the Old Norse peoples, as you understand it?
Well, considering that Baltic amber has been found in Minoan tombs, I think that there was a connection. The Minoans themselves were mostly seafarers. They lived on an island. They had their ships that they sailed all around the Mediterranean. It's possible that they sailed outside the Mediterranean. There's no proof, but we know for certain that they sailed the entire Mediterranean basin.
Yeah.
In addition to that, there were extensive overland trade routes throughout Europe and Western Asia during the Bronze Age. I think the way that history, especially ancient history, is taught in the schools does a disservice to the people of those cultures, because we tend to think of them as, or maybe the history textbooks characterize ancient cultures as very much staying in place and not not being as sort of globalized as we think of ourselves now. But the fact that there is, Baltic amber in Minoan tombs, the Minoans had peacocks. Those had to be imported from India. Okay. Yeah, so there were extensive trade routes, and and it goes back beyond that, well into the Paleolithic. You see various items that have been carried hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers from where they originated. So yeah, there was a lot more movement and a lot more contact in the ancient world than our ancestors have been given credit for.
No, I would agree with that. I'm also thinking of all the ships we see in rock art in Scandinavia, for instance. If you look at like the petroglyphs in a country like Sweden, it's extraordinary like how many of these petroglyphs seem to be ships. There are also like sometimes the case is made for them being sledges and they may have traveled over snow, but nevertheless you get a very strong feeling of an early seafaring culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Intention that the Minoans sailed outside the Mediterranean up the Atlantic coast as far as the British Isles, because that's one of the sources of the tin that they used to make their bronze.
Yeah.
It could have been brought overland, but it also could have come by ship.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah. And another thing I really hear from you, and I've had a good look at the website as well, is that you emphasized how peaceful the people were who lived on Crete for millennia ago, and how they enjoyed thousands of years of peace and prosperity, even when their neighbors were like engaged in like battles and wars and things like that, which would actually make them a bit of an example for our times. I think the Vikings less so, because of course they were known for raiding and starting battles all over the place. But would you like to speak to that a bit? Like, what it looks like to actually live in peace and not with a kind of battlefield mindset?
Yeah, so I would like to begin with the caveat that the Minoans were not a utopia. They were not perfect. They were human, just like everybody else. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from their culture and bring into the modern world, maybe as a way to do things better. So the Minoans were in a unique position. They were actually kind of weird for Bronze Age people in the Mediterranean. Let me give you a little background. Their ancestors lived in Anatolia, in Western Anatolia, what is today Turkey, during the Neolithic era. And that's when agriculture began and populations were expanding. So there were a lot of waves of migration out of that area, people looking for new land as the population expanded. And one of those waves of migration came down into the Aegean and settled on Crete, and they became the Minoans. So there's DNA research. That's how we know that this is where they came from and who they were. So their culture, when it began on Crete, was based in Neolithic Anatolian culture, which is very similar to the old European culture that Maria Gimbutas studied. Very similar symbol sets, very similar practices. And so over time, it looks like what happened as the Minoans became more expansive on the island and began building up their business and their trade, they maintained those older religious practices. It looks very much like even as they built big temples and became more modern by Bronze Age standards, they maintained Neolithic religious practices and probably also cultural values, which is interesting because what that means is that all of their neighbors around the Eastern Mediterranean would have thought of them as those weird Orthodox people who are not keeping up with the times. That set of values underlies their entire culture. Okay, so that's where that comes from. And they were also in a very unique position because Crete is an island. It's a big island. It's 150 kilometers long, but it's because it's an island, there are no borders, to threaten anyone else or to be threatened. So they were kind of like, they've been described as the Switzerland of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. Okay. So they didn't have a military. The only evidence of any military comes from the time of the Mycenaean occupation toward the end. And the Mycenaeans were early Greeks who were extremely militaristic and warlike. And so we have evidence of military from that era, but that's not the Minoans, that's the Mycenaeans. With the possible exception of maybe a merchant marine to help protect their trading ships, the Minoans didn't have a military, and they didn't have borders with any other empire, so they weren't a threat to anybody. And so that put them in the unique position of being able to be essentially merchants to every culture around the Mediterranean, even the ones who were at war with each other.
Yeah, wow, that is a unique position. But did they need to defend their sea borders or their coasts?
No one seems to have been interested in actually attacking them, except the Mycenaeans eventually burned down all the Minoan cities around 50 BC because they were unable to take over. So they just destroyed it instead. But no, apparently nobody wanted to attack them because you don't want to destroy the place that you're buying all the good stuff from.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
The Minoans were quite wealthy. They had the best bronze. Their recipes for bronze were highly prized. There is a bit of irony in them being such a peaceful culture. Because they made such great bronze, they sold daggers and swords and spearheads and all kinds of things like that to all the cultures around them, which, if you want to be really literal about it, that might make them the world's first international arms dealers.
Arms traders. Wow. Gosh, there's always that duality, isn't there? The peaceful culture selling arms. Wow. Wow, how interesting. Yeah. And I had not realized that. For me, that's completely new information. It's very interesting. Yeah. Gosh. Okay. Well, I think, we've set the scene, so we have a better idea now, like what kind of culture they were. I would personally really love to hear about some of the deities and the gods and the goddesses, because I am a member of your group and as follow the post at home, and I know that really beautiful work is being done, for instance working with the dove goddess, but I also know that you are working on creating ceremonies to honor certain things that Minoans honored, like the festival of honoring the waters, I believe. Can you tell us something about that aspect of the tradition?
Okay, so we started out building the pantheon using the fragments of Minoan myth that survived into Greek mythology. And the Greeks were functionally a conquering culture compared to the Minoans, right? Mm-hmm. You have to look at the relationship of the Greeks to the Minoans as similar to the relationship of the Romans to the Druids, or maybe even similar to the relationship of the colonial European powers to the Native Americans.
Right, yeah.
So the information that the Greeks maintained and folded into their mythology was altered, their own purposes. So essentially, all we had to start with was a handful of deities and a few tidbits of information about them. So we assumed that Ariadne, Rhea, Dionysus, Aletheia, Zagreus, and these other gods and goddesses who were clearly Minoan, but part of the the Greek pantheon, the Hellenic pantheon,
Mm.
we assume that they fit into a human-style family tree, just
Yeah.
like the Greek pantheon and just like the Roman pantheon after it. So we started trying to wedge them into a human-style family tree, and they immediately began to rebel. And so it took a good deal of spirit journeying and meditation and conversation with the deities to figure out that their pantheon was very different. It does not have the kind of hierarchy that a family tree style pantheon does. And what little hierarchy there is does not place a male god at the top.
Yeah.
And yeah, what we ended up with at the top is a triplicity of mother goddesses.
Wow. Yeah.
And two of them are actually attested in Greek mythology and in the Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean Greeks. And the third we had to find through dance ethnology.
Wow.
So that was a bit of a journey. So the top, or the base and the top of our pantheon is the three mothers, Rhea, Posidaia, and Tarasia, and they represent the realms of land, sea, and sky.
Right.
And so the three realms turned out to be very important. And you were asking earlier how people find us. A surprising number of druids, people who practice druidry, have shown up and helped us walk this path. And interestingly, land, sky, and sea are important in druidry as well.
How interesting.
Yeah.
But also, it is another connection between Crete and further north, isn't it? I mean, going back to the trade routes and that they travel more widely than we believe, or that we commonly think or are taught in history classes. You know, there were way more connections, I have come to think, than I was taught in school. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So we have the three mothers, and each of them has a son and a daughter, and that's as close as we get to the family tree, and then beyond that it just gets all tangled. But so the daughters are Ariadne, Arachne, and Anthea.
Yeah.
And the three sons are Tauros, Asterion, Corydallos, and Dionysus. Right.
How interesting. Yeah.
So, but yeah, beyond that, we have the horned gods. That's been quite a journey. Most people know about the Minotaur. What most people don't know is that Theseus is not a Minoan character at all.
He isn't. Okay.
No. He's a Greek culture hero.
Yeah.
Who dates to the classical era. He did not exist in Minoan times.
Right.
And the Minotaur story was a very late addition to his set of mythos. He has whole bunches of other adventures. And it wasn't until about 300 or 400 BCE that the Minotaur story was added to his mythos. And it was probably for political purposes at the time.
How interesting. The Wiccan, I think one of my sort of big discoveries, you know, I studied Latin and Greek in grammar school, and I was served up the classical pantheon the way you do in secondary school. So a very big discovery for me was at some point realizing that there was earlier material, like for instance, with the story of Persephone. You know, I was taught that story with a kind of, call it like a patriarchal overlay of that. You know, Persephone is abducted into the underworld, and Owen's wrote a blog about this, and we had some contact over that. But then to sort of discover also through more direct evaluation work, my own students, like working with that particular myth, they sort of realize, well, there is an earlier myth, but also connecting directly, you realize that Persephone both wanted to go and needed to go. It's also a story of leaving the realm of your mother and establishing your own thing. But then it's also about returning. But actually that whole sort of overlay of being abducted, I discovered, is not a necessary feature. So I'm wondering, is there a similar thing as the Minotaur? That's always a story I've been interested in. Like, you know, is there an earlier version to that, or something that we don't commonly know?
Yeah, I mean, the story that we have is the one that we have reconstructed for ourselves via shared. That whole tale with Theseus and the Minotaur and King Minos and Ariadne. Theseus is Greek. All those other characters are Minoan deities. So Ariadne was not a girl, she's a goddess. Minos was not a king, he's a god, and so is the Minotaur. So Minos is an underworld god, very much a guardian of the dead, and the Minotaur is one of a set of 6 horned deities. They come in male-female pairs. And interestingly, the Minotaur is the only male one whose name has survived. There are cattle horned ones and goat horned ones and deer horned ones.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So, yeah, so we have the cattle ones are the Minotaur and Europa. And you were talking about the abduction aspect of a tale being a later addition from the dominator societies. The story of Europa involves her being abducted by Zeus. He spends so much time abducting goddesses. He really needs to get a hobby.
Yes.
But it is likely that originally that story about Europa was one not involving the Greek Olympian Zeus, but involving the Minotaur and a voluntary connection between the two, a sacred marriage.
Yeah, exactly. That makes so much more sense intuitively speaking, doesn't it? How wonderful. Yeah.
It can be really hard peeling the layers back, because you have to think, you know, what did the later culture intend? Why did they borrow this story, and how would they have changed it for their own purposes?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But also I think that is what cultures do. Again, going back to my grammar school education, and with the best intentions, I'm sure I'm not being critical of Dutch education. There's excellent education in the Netherlands. But by my own thesis was presented as, this is the pantheon, those are the tales, and you know, this is the mythology. And it's taken me a long while in my own life to do a little peeling back as well, and to realize that even if you leave out of it that you would have a dominant or conqueror culture that sort of rewrites things for their own purposes, but even if you forget about that, mythology is a living thing, just like language is a living thing. So for me, that was a really, you know, quite a long time ago now, but a realization that there is no such thing as this is the mythology of a country or of a culture, but you know, it's a living thing, and the stories, the myths, the deities, and the other divine beings, you know, they're always like kind of evolving along with us. It's like they're not a static thing. And it was just such a big discovery, because otherwise you just think you can go online and look up a mythological fact and then you know what you're dealing with, and it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I think that goes along with the idea that because of the way history is taught in the schools, a lot of us start out sort of mentally formulating the ancient world as just one great big solid chunk that happened all at the same time. But there were so many centuries and millennia during which things changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, even within Minoan Crete, that's just a few thousand years. They were like the Egyptians in this regard. They didn't replace religion, bits of their religion with new things. They just added on later
Yeah.
until there was more and more. So for instance, early on, you get Dionysus as just the vine god and the god of ecstasy and the gift of meditation. But later on, he also becomes essentially a solar year king, a representation of the solar year. And at that point, he's the divine child who is born to the goddess in her sacred cave at winter solstice.
Right, yeah.
That's another aspect. And so you can't say this is who Dionysus is. You have to say, well, this is who he is at this point in time, and this is who he is at this point in time. What do you want to connect with? You know?
Exactly. You have to add a period and a location and a context to it. You can't just say this is Dionysus. But that's the thing I'm learning with the Norse gods as well, that we're very keen to freeze them in place, like Freya always does this and this is how it is. But the more I work in direct relationship with various, Norse gods and other beings, I learn more and more, both that they are like different from what I have learned from others. And that's like fine, because, it's good. We need to go on a personal journey. But I'm also learning that they are evolving like I am evolving. That, they don't actually want to be static. So I get very strong guidance that just as we as human beings are like moving on, the gods want to, through relationship with us, have that freedom to also evolve. They don't want to be frozen in a time or place. Do you find that as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. We even have a lot of, I mentioned that a lot of people come to modern Minoan paganism because they're looking for something that happened before. They're looking for an anchor point before the classical era.
Yeah.
Some of our deities have almost literally dragged us back to the Neolithic or even the Paleolithic to kind of say to us, look at who I was in this time and place. And I can have a relationship with you as this aspect of myself.
Yeah.
And then they also have the faces that they are now.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
They continue to exist just like we do. And so there is what you might even call a modern aspect to these deities. Like for instance, Tarasia, who is the sun mother goddess, she has let a number of us know that electricity belongs to her.
Yeah.
So, they're very connected with the modern world as long as they have people through humans through whom they can relate to the world.
Yeah, exactly. But this is the thing I often say to my students, at the end of the day, the gods need us as much as we need the gods.
Yes.
It's like a partnership. But sometimes people get into the whole thing of, and often, again, with all respect, if people come from a Christian background where there is this kind of like, oh, there's this one and almighty God, and you like look up to that, and that God is like, in a way, miles and miles away. But then to realize that you can actually be in personal relationship with the deity, and that deity is an evolving being, also operating like in the same time frame that you do, and of course in other time frames as well. You just get a far more multi-dimensional picture. And then often when teaching, I'll say to students, well, this is so and so in this manifestation or in that aspect, but you can no longer just say, well, this is Dionysus or this is Freya. That breaks down because it is not specific enough for what you want to communicate, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it has been interesting as we have built our modern spiritual practice with these deities, trying to translate some of the ancient practices into the modern day. Because obviously we are not going to do human sacrifice or animal sacrifice now.
Well, exactly.
But we want to make offerings, and and libations are a very big part of our spiritual practice. And so we can look at the list of things that people in the Bronze Age probably offered, but we've got a whole bunch of new and different stuff in the modern world.
Which the gods really like, in my experience. They're quite excited about giving something new.
Yes. I mean, who knew that deities would like modern candies or
Oh,
you know,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
all kinds of things that they are just as delighted to be in the world now as we are.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
exactly. Yeah, yeah. That's like we're finding that in our tradition as well. And like it shouldn't be surprising really when you think about it. But it's like a mindset we have to unlock ourselves from.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I have to think that mindset comes at least partly from the pervasive Christian influence
yeah,
in society, the idea that everything is linear and static.
yeah, yeah.
I think that's where a lot of that comes from. And we're all raised in it, whether we were raised Christian or not. We're raised in the culture that is permeated
We're
by
all in a culture. It permeates a culture, like, even if
yeah.
you step away from it. So yeah, definitely. Yeah,
And it can once you realize, wait a minute, what if things aren't actually linear? What if things are cyclical instead? What
yeah,
if and what if it's not static? What if there is motion?
yeah.
Yeah, it's a sort of a freeing realization.
I think it is. It is very liberating and a bit mind blowing as well. Because when you first
Yes.
start doing that work, it's a bit like, oh, like, hang on, am I even standing on firm ground? There were so many things I took for granted and were like blown away. And I also find that in my work, teaching like Old Norse traditions and Seder, I have so much educating to do because there was a kind of romantic period where Norse mythology was discovered again. Then you had a lot of predominantly male academics, because that's the way it was in those days, who sort of said, oh, it is like this, and these are the lists of the deities, and the lists of the worlds or whatever. And actually, when you really read the text, it's not even correct. So what I now find with my own student, and then that material is still out there, it circulates in the books about mythology and the blogs and all of it. So the amount of time that I spend where I call my students back and I said, I'm really sorry, but I've got news for you. This is not actually correct. You go back to the source, this word is used, or in this well-known text, there's a passage that explains quite clearly how it was. And I think that's really important work also, because otherwise, and I said this is a simplification, but so to speak, in that romantic period, they could have cooked up a kind of like fantasy and the excitement of discovering the material again. And if we are not critical and we don't do our own research, let alone our own, personal gnosis, then we could be running that into the future as a kind of historical fact. So that's the thing that I'm really sort of nibbling away at in my own teaching work. I think my students do appreciate it, but in the beginning, when they first work with me, some people find it difficult because they like coming in thinking they know what is what, and it's not as simple as that.
Yeah, it's never as simple as you want it to be.
No, it's not tidy. It's not always coherent. But also if it would be too coherent, it just doesn't make sense, because ultimately it's like a reflection of how the human mind evolves through time. So I've become quite suspicious of anything too tidy or too neat a list. I immediately think, hang on, what is really going on there?
Yeah. Yeah, it's also I just, as you were describing that, I just thought of something that is another sort of connection between the Minoans and the northern peoples. There is a practice that I have read about from the Iron Age, Scandinavian countries, where when people are looking to find a new place to settle, they will get on a ship and they will ask the gods to guide them. And they, wherever the gods lead the ship. And we think the Minoans had something similar. And we have, in a certain sense, in creating these modern practices that your group and my group are doing, we have set ourselves on those kinds of ships and asked the gods to guide us to where we need to go. And instead of telling them where we need to go, we are asking them to show us. And that's a completely different voyage.
Yeah, and also in the asking, you open up the space. Because when assuming something is a certain way, like your mind is closed, you may not realize it, but there's quite a lot of closed mind around that. And the moment you can ask the right question, you create a space within yourself for new information to come in. And once you do that, as you say, you're on a ship and the journey starts. And maybe you're leaving the shore behind and you do not yet see the shore you're headed for, but your journey has started, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's something that some people have a little trouble with, especially the concept of things changing over time, because even just in the few years that we've been doing this Minoan journey, I started out with all the usual kinds of preconceptions that everybody has about the Minoans.
Of course.
And I've had to change my mind so many times, it's a wonder it hasn't fallen out of my head. But that's uncomfortable for some people. They want things to be definite. They want something
predictable, yeah.
Yeah, and set down in black and white, and it's not going to change. And it has been a journey for me to be able to accept that even the stuff that we think we're right about might be wrong. That we have to be willing to admit when we find information that shows that something needs to be changed.
Yeah.
To just honestly communicate that and say, look, it turns out that we really ought to do this way, or that the way we thought things were is not correct.
Yeah.
And so that's definitely a learning experience.
It's a very steep learning curve, especially when you're working with other people, or, maybe you've been in the public eye, an interview or a book, or, and I know, this happens to me because it's always evolving. And I sometimes have to say, well, what I wrote in that book, actually, since, new information has come, and my mind has changed, and my understanding has expanded. So I can't even say that everything I wrote in 2015 still holds true today. So you're not only dealing with a body of material that kind of shapeshifts in some ways, but you're also dealing with how your own understanding and the person you were is always changing.
Yeah.
And I remember in an earlier phase, hit a sort of moment of difficulty with that. It's kind of almost, you could become paralyzed and think, oh, I can't say anything in public anymore. I can't publish anything anymore for that reason. But then also, I was talking to a very close friend, and what we arrived at is that just as, you and I both have made a journey where you start with a series of assumptions or teachings and then it changes, there will be people who are on that same path and they have to make that same journey. So in a way, the earlier things that I know have left, like a blog from an earlier time, could still be a railway station where someone arrives for a moment and says that resonates, and then the journey continues again. So there's also the multidimensionality of teaching. It's not only like me teaching a group of people today, but it's also like things that have already created or that are out there can meet people who are still making that journey. They're like maybe islands on the way to the final destination or something. And I've had to agree with myself that has to be okay, because there is no other way of doing it.
That's a really beautiful way of putting it. Yeah, it's the shape-shifting of the whole human relationship with the divine. And it moves and flows over time, and where anyone is drawn to make that connection is appropriate for them at any given time, and that may or may not be where you are at that point. But yeah, I can see how that, the things the things that I thought and wrote about in 2014 do still help people find their way to the Minoan gods.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's exactly right. There are some things that in my first book was published in 2016. That was Natural Born Shamans. And if I wrote it again, the bulk of it would come out the same, but there are things that would be different. But I think any author you speak to is on a path of discovery and evolving would say that. So just that's also, you've been an author in a longer time than I have. But at some point, that's also being an author, you have to realize that there's even a distance between you and the books you wrote in a certain year. which is not to say that people can't find them and do fantastic work based on those books. So it's kind of like learning to live with our own multi-dimensionality as well.
Yeah.
And like once you can do that, then life becomes so rich. It's actually a beautiful thing. And another thing that's really helped me when I was struggling with these issues was I listened to some YouTube documentaries about like science and discoveries in like quantum physics, modern physics, astrophysics. And then one of the scientists said very, very clearly, any sort of science, like what is presented to us as science, is only an assumption or a theory we hold until it's proven to us that it doesn't work completely and there is a better way of explaining that. And in that moment, it needs to be jettisoned and like a whole new theory needs to be formulated, which will then serve for a time until again, you have a genius like Stephen Hawking or Einstein who comes and, and that is the way that science evolves. So even because it's often presented to us again in secondary school that science is the hard knowledge, is like what we know for sure.
Right.
I did all the science subjects for A level and you get that mindset. And again, for me, that was a revelation to think that, ultimately there is a place for science and methodology you need, because science is only a collection of very clever, and a lot of it, I'm not putting it down at all, I love science, but it's a collection of stories, theories that explain something until another fact or discovery or better telescope or something comes along, and it all has to be revised. I think that's the way that it's the human condition, is the way the human personal and collective mind evolves. That's become my philosophy.
That makes sense. I mean, our interaction with the world moves and evolves along with us. And so I guess if you think about it, nothing that that we think or believe or think we know is going to be the same 10 years from now as it is now.
Yeah.
So it's depending on how you look at that, it could be either frightening or completely liberating.
It's both, isn't it? And I like the way you put it, just to put another 2 words in rather than to say, I know. It's like, I think I know. I believe at this time. Like when teaching places such as to my best knowledge or where I am right now. But I no longer feel able to say, this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And then in the beginning, for some students, that is a bit too much. Like as we discussed earlier, they want the hard certainty. But people who truly want to evolve and grow, they get that mindset. And, like you just say, it can be an exhilarating journey to really realize that. Because also there is so much possibility for growth and change. And that is not only with, mythology and our spirituality, but also other areas in our life. If we can actually learn to drop a long-held belief in favor of a belief that serves better, that can literally change our lives. It's like creating power in that. Yeah. Well, as a final question, I'd like to ask, how do you deal with academics? Because I know that in the Northern tradition, you sort of get the 2 pillars. You get the people sort of like me, who are generally called more reconstructionists than revivalists, because we have more of the text left. But as you were already explaining, like ultimately the 2 meet in the middle. So not to put a too fine point on that. But that is like one, quite large group of people doing important work. But then, of course, we have academia as well. And there are incredibly many people who research the, the Scandinavian material, the sagas, all of it. But for them, it's an academic research project. And when I read some of these PhD theses, I read a lot of them in a lot of different languages to see what the latest is, what the forefront of the thinking and the discoveries is. So I love doing that. But also with some of them, things are beautifully described and people have an incredible amount of academic knowledge. But also they mention somewhere in the text that they go to church on Sunday. So you get a feeling, or that they're not like believers. For them, it's just something they study, but it's not something they like embody and kind of like they dedicate their lives to it. But anyway, that can, and I think in the Northern tradition, the academics don't pay a lot of attention to what the other group is doing. So we're largely left in peace. But on your Facebook page, I get the impression that you have more encounters with academics and academia. Is that true or not?
Not really. The closest we come is that there are some academics who study modern paganism as a way of people connecting with the ancient world, and those academics tend to look askance at any kind of spirituality. Most of them tend to be atheists, in my experience.
Okay, yeah.
But I have actually talked with a lot of archaeologists. We've always been clear in Ariadne's tribe that we are not trying to tell the world who the Minoans were. We are simply trying to be a modern path in connection with those deities. And so most archaeologists are actually privately very happy to talk about their work in the of religion, especially the younger generations. Archaeology is changing dramatically. But there are still so many restrictions in the academic world on what kinds of things you can write in a paper and still be you know. So we rely pretty extensively on academic research, but I have also learned that if you contact archaeologists privately and say, look, I'm not interested in having your name anywhere on anything, I would just like your
private dialogue.
Right. Just your personal opinion. And many of them are actually not nearly as ambivalent about spirituality as you might think. Most of them were drawn to these ancient cultures because they felt the same kind of pull that we do. They just express it in a different way.
That's right.
So yeah, it's not, there's not as much of a real divide as I think there looks like there is.
No, but I think it's also that, at least that's what I observe in the Scandinavian sector, that having a private conversation with someone behind the scenes, and I do some of that myself, and I learned some very interesting things also in the world of art, by the way, like the people who are like maybe established art lecturers who like behind the scenes are willing to talk about art in a different way. So yeah, I think it's across the board. It's not only say in the in our two traditions. I'm observing that it's something that's like happening in all the fields where I dip a toe in the water. But there is that thing also that people are under kind of obligation to protect their reputations, and they've worked really hard to establish themselves in a certain field, and that then requires they play by the rules of that field, or they might end up being, they may not have grants, they may not have work, they may not be taken seriously. It has quite dire professional consequences. And there, I think we in the sort of more whatever pagan, heathen, reconstructionist, revivalist communities, in a way we have more freedom because we're not under those constrictions. So we're in a way in a more of a luxury position, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that academia and so many fields are just policed. They are, it kind of makes me sad. You mentioned quantum physics earlier. There's the fallacy of the objective observer, right? So it's not possible to observe without connecting with what you're observing, without acting with it in some way. But that fallacy, the idea behind the fallacy is what so much of academia is based on. The anthropologists and the archaeologists and the historians who insist that they are capable of being objective about their fellow human beings and those people's lives in the modern and the ancient world. And you can't, it's not possible to be objective. That is a fallacy. And so that
it's very much a fallacy. But another beautiful thing that I have realized about that same thing, which again I often share with students, is that people often say, oh, I'm kind of like nobody, I don't have a name, whatever. I live in a small village and I, like I don't even do much outside the house. So like I can't like do anything. And I often say to people, that's not actually right. Simply by observing and witnessing, if you are willing to acknowledge that you're in the role of an observer, and then you can even take it to the level of sacred witnessing, like consciously, like making a choice to consciously be present and observe. That in itself is already having an impact. You don't actually need to sort of have a profession and leave your house in your village or be famous or whatever, but have an impact on the world, what's happening around you. All you need to do is to observe and bear witness. There's actually a claim of liberation in that idea as well, isn't there?
Well, that turns an ordinary mindless activity into a sacred mindful activity.
That's it. Yeah. That's it. And then we get to the point which I wrote about in my sacred art book, that like every single thing we do in a day can be a sacred act. It's all about the mindset that we bring to it. But really, like everything around us is or can be sacred. And everything we do can be a sacred act. The only difference is like what mindset we bring to what we do. So the power lies with us. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're coming up to the 1 hour mark. I will close by asking, did you have a question for me also, or are we done for today?
I do have one question, which is, if you were to step onto that boat and let the gods guide you, where would you ask them to guide you to?
I think I would leave that up to the gods, per definition. I would, like my husband is a sailor. I do spend time on boats. And this is not how we operate in reality when we take the family thing, I have to be honest. But if it was just more like me, I feel my whole spirit canoe is guided by the gods. And like most of the things I do were not things that I planned to do. There was just a very strong like guidance or request from spirit, like writing a book about the pre-Christian spirituality of like the Low Countries and the Netherlands. I would never have thought a few years ago that I would do that, but when the request came, first like several students voicing it, and then it like came from the other world as well, saying that use the students as a mouthpiece, but I wasn't listening. And then at some point you realize, oh, this is something I'm called to do, I'm actually in a position to do. So I would say that my spirit canoe is always like bobbing on the waters. And in truth, I may look quite purposeful. I know people tell me that I can give the impression of being purposeful and focused, and I am focused. But I really don't know where the boat is going to take me next. So I cannot tell you from that point of view what I'll be doing in 4 or 5 years' time. Could be as big a surprise for me as for anyone else.
So you have the ultimate gift, which is that you trust that the gods will guide you where you need to go.
Yeah, totally. For me, that is the big sort of guiding principle, and everything else is subordinate to that. Of course, in everyday reality, I've got to keep my life now. I mean, I have a diary and a journal. I mess things up sometimes, like the Zoom link you got set for 9 o'clock this evening. So, like I'm not claiming to be perfect. And in the running of my ship, I make navigational mistakes. I'm completely human. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that's what my spiritual path has given me. An utter and complete trust that the gods will take me where I need to go. And also that, to focus on the here and now, I don't actually need to know where that is. Like maybe if I had known all of that in advance, that would detract from what I'm doing in the moment. So we're back to the items along the way, the stopover places or the transit places. If I knew what might be asked of me in the future, it would take attention away from what I need to focus on now. So I'm completely at peace with not knowing that.
Very nice.
All right. Then I'm going to bring it to a close, because I know if you make really long recording, people are going to have difficulties finding the time to listen to it. So Laura Perry, you've been on my wish list for so long. I'm an admirer of your books and your work. So it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. And also, I know you are busy, I am busy. Thank you for freeing up the time, committing to the time, so we could finally do it. So thank you so very much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. So everyone, I will be back with episode number 24, probably sometime early March. I'll let you know then, who the guest is going to be. Goodbye for now.